Some horses are born to run wild, and no amount of human intervention can change that fundamental truth. But in a dusty corner of Nevada, one Mustang was about to teach everyone who met him that there's a profound difference between being broken and choosing to trust. When Sarah Blake first laid eyes on Havoc, the notorious stallion that had defeated every trainer who tried to work with him, she saw something that others had missed. This wasn't a horse that needed to be conquered. This was a spirit that demanded to be understood. What happened next would challenge everything the horse world believed about wildness, domestication, and the unbreakable bond between human and horse. If this incredible story of courage, respect, and the triumph of understanding over force moves you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss how this untrainable stallion became a legend and changed the way an entire community thought about what it means to truly connect with a wild heart. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from as we dive into this remarkable tale of mutual respect. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Bureau of Land Management holding facility in Palomino Valley, Nevada, as Sarah Blake walked slowly between the pipe corrals that housed hundreds of wild Mustangs captured from the ranges. At 34, Sarah had the lean, weathered look of someone who had spent most of her adult life working with horses. But there was something different about her approach that set her apart from other trainers. Where others saw animals to be subdued, Sarah saw spirits to be understood. Sarah had grown up on a small ranch in Montana, the daughter of a horse trainer who believed that every horse could be reached if you just found the right key. But her father's methods had been traditional, based on dominance, pressure, and the gradual wearing down of a horse's resistance until submission became easier than fighting. It wasn't until Sarah encountered natural horsemanship in her 20s that she began to understand there might be another way. Now, she ran the Wild Heart Sanctuary, a small facility dedicated to helping difficult horses find their place in the world. She specialized in the horses that others had given up on, the ones labeled dangerous, untrainable, or simply too wild to ever be useful. Her reputation for working with impossible cases had brought her to the BLM facility today, responding to a call about a stallion that had been through the adoption process 4 times and returned each time as unsuitable for domestic use. The facility manager, Tom Brooks, was a gruff man in his 50s who had been dealing with wild horses for over 20 years. As he led Sarah through the maze of corral, his expression grew increasingly skeptical. "I got to tell you, Sarah, I think you're wasting your time with this one," Tom said, pausing in front of a large corner corral that seemed empty at first glance. "Havoc has been nothing but trouble since the day we brought him in 2 years ago. He's hurt 3 trainers, destroyed more equipment than I can count, and every family that's tried to adopt him has brought him back within a month." Sarah studied the corral more carefully and finally spotted the horse standing motionless in the far corner, pressed against the fence as if trying to disappear into the metal panels. He was magnificent. A steel-gray stallion with a black mane and tail, probably around 6 years old, with the powerful build and alert bearing that spoke of generations of survival in the wild. But it was his eyes that caught Sarah's attention. They weren't filled with the fear she expected to see in a traumatized animal. Instead, they held something much more complex. A fierce intelligence combined with an absolute refusal to accept defeat. "What exactly has he done that's so terrible?" Sarah asked, noting how the stallion watched her every movement without shifting his own position. Tom pulled out a thick folder from his clipboard. "Where do I start?" The first family that adopted him tried to train him for ranch work. He broke out of 3 different corrals, jumped a 6-foot fence, and was found 20 m away, trying to rejoin his original herd. The second family thought they could gentle him with time and patience. He tolerated their handling for about 2 weeks. Then one day, he just snapped. Didn't hurt anyone, but he destroyed half their barn trying to get out. Sarah listened, but her attention was focused on Havoc. The stallion had begun to move closer, drawn perhaps by curiosity or simply by her calm presence. His steps were careful, deliberate, each hoof placement calculated. The third family hired a professional trainer, Tom continued. Guy claimed he could break any horse in 30 days. Havoc put him in the hospital on day 2. Not out of meanness, mind you. The trainer said later that the horse never actually attacked him. He just refused to be dominated. When the trainer tried to force him into submission, Havoc fought back with everything he had. And the fourth family, Sarah prompted, though she was beginning to understand the pattern. Last month, nice people, experienced with horses. They thought maybe Havoc just needed a gentler approach. But the horse wouldn't bond with them, wouldn't accept their leadership, wouldn't even consistently come to them for food. After 3 weeks, they said it was like trying to domesticate a wolf. He might tolerate them, but he'd never truly accept them. Havoc had moved close enough now that Sarah could see the scars on his body, rope burns, fence cuts, and the calloused areas where halters had rubbed during countless training sessions. But despite the evidence of struggle, there was nothing defeated about his posture. If anything, he looked more like a warrior who had fought many battles and emerged unbroken. Has anyone ever tried just accepting him as he is? Sarah asked quietly. Tom looked at her as if she'd suggested something absurd. Sarah, he's a domestic horse now. He can't just run wild forever. He needs to serve some purpose. Ranch work, trail riding, something that justifies the cost of keeping him. The BLM can't just warehouse horses that refuse to integrate into human society. But Sarah was no longer listening to Tom's practical concerns. She was watching Havoc, who had approached close enough to the fence that she could see the intricate patterns of gray and white in his coat, the intelligent curve of his neck, the way his ears flickered forward to catch every sound she made. This wasn't a broken horse, or even a dangerous one. This was a horse who had simply never been given a reason to trust that humans could offer him something better than what he'd had in the wild. "I'll take him," Sarah said simply. Tom stared at her. "Sarah, you didn't even get in the corral with him. You don't know what he's really like." "I know enough," she replied, pulling out her phone to take pictures of Havoc for her adoption paperwork. "This horse isn't refusing to be trained. He's refusing to be diminished. There's a difference." The drive back to Wild Heart Sanctuary took 4 hours, with Havoc standing quietly in the trailer, despite Tom's warnings about his transportation issues. Through the small window that connected the truck cab to the trailer, Sarah could see the stallion's silhouette, alert but calm, as if he understood that this journey might be different from the others. Wild Heart Sanctuary sat on 180 acres of rolling hills and sagebrush in northern Nevada, land that Sarah had inherited from her grandfather and gradually converted into a refuge for horses that didn't fit the traditional molds. The facility was designed with large paddocks that allowed horses to move freely, and the training areas were set up to give animals choices rather than forcing them into compliance. When Sarah backed the trailer up to the largest paddock, a 5-acre space surrounded by tall pipe fencing, she could sense Havoc's tension. He had been through this process before, and past experience had taught him that unloading into a new place usually meant another attempt to strip away everything that made him who he was. "Easy, boy," Sarah said softly as she opened the trailer gate. "This time is going to be different." Havoc emerged from the trailer with the fluid grace of a natural athlete, his head high and nostrils flared as he assessed his new environment. The paddock was larger than anything he'd experienced in captivity, with natural terrain that allowed him to see for miles across the valley. For the first time since his capture, he could run if he wanted to. And run he did. The moment Sarah released him into the paddock, Havoc took off across the space with a joy that was breathtaking to witness. His powerful legs ate up the ground, his mane and tail streaming behind him like banners of freedom. He ran circuits around the entire paddock, testing its boundaries, memorizing every hill and draw, claiming the space as his own territory. Sarah watched from outside the fence, making no attempt to interfere or call him to her. She understood that this display wasn't defiance, it was celebration. For the first time in 2 years, Havoc was being allowed to express his essential nature without human interference. After nearly an hour of running, the stallion finally slowed to a walk, his breathing heavy, but his expression more relaxed than Sarah had seen in the BLM facility. He wandered the paddock at his own pace, investigating the water trough, testing the quality of the hay, and gradually working his way back toward where Sarah stood at the fence. When he finally approached her, it was entirely on his own terms. He stood about 10 feet away, close enough to study her, but far enough to escape if necessary. Sarah remained perfectly still, allowing him to make all the decisions about their interaction. "I'm not going to try to change you," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. "You've been through enough people trying to make you into something you're not. I just want to understand who you are." Havoc tilted his head at the sound of her voice. His ears pricked forward with interest. There was something different about this human's energy. No pressure, no agenda, no underlying current of dominance, seeking submission. That first week set the tone for everything that would follow. Sarah made no attempt to halter Havoc or enter his paddock uninvited. Instead, she simply showed up twice a day with his feed and fresh water, speaking to him quietly while she worked, but making no demands on his attention or cooperation. She would sit on a nearby hill with her morning coffee, watching him graze and move through his space with the fluid grace that marked him as truly wild. The change in Havoc was gradual, but unmistakable. The constant tension that had defined his posture at the BLM facility began to ease. His head dropped from the high-alert position he'd maintained during 2 years of captivity, and his movements became more fluid and natural. Most remarkably, he began to approach the fence when Sarah arrived, drawn by curiosity rather than the demand for food. Dr. Angela Reeves, Sarah's veterinarian and oldest friend, visited on Thursday of the first week to give Havoc his routine health check. Angela specialized in equine behavior and had worked with Sarah on dozens of difficult cases over the years. "I have to admit, I was skeptical when you told me about taking on Havoc," Angela said as she observed the stallion from outside his paddock. His reputation preceded him, but look at him now. I've never seen such a complete transformation in just 1 week. Havoc stood about 20 feet away, watching the two women with alert but relaxed attention. His coat had already begun to develop the healthy shine that came from reduced stress, and his appetite had improved dramatically. "The secret isn't transformation," Sarah replied, offering Havoc a handful of apple slices through the fence. He approached cautiously, but took them gently from her palm. "It's recognition. Everyone else was trying to transform him into their idea of what a domestic horse should be. I'm just trying to recognize him for what he already is, which is what exactly." Sarah watched as Havoc finished the apples and remained near the fence, his muzzle just inches from her outstretched hand. A partner, not a subordinate. A horse who's willing to cooperate if he's treated as an equal rather than property to be controlled. The breakthrough came in the 3rd week, and it happened entirely on Havoc's terms. Sarah was sitting on her usual hill, reading a book while Havoc grazed nearby when she heard the unmistakable sound of hoofbeats approaching. She looked up to see the stallion walking directly toward her. No fence between them, his expression curious but calm. Sarah's heart raced as she realized what was happening. Havoc had somehow opened the gate to his paddock, a gate that required lifting a heavy latch and sliding a metal bar. He had figured out the mechanism and freed himself not to escape the property, but to approach her on equal terms. "Well, hello there," Sarah said softly, setting down her book, but making no sudden movements. "Did you decide you wanted to meet me properly?" Havoc stopped about 6 feet away from her, close enough to reach out and touch her, but maintaining his own space. They regarded each other in silence for several minutes, horse and human taking each other's measure without the barrier of fencing between them. Finally, Havoc took one step closer than another until he was standing directly in front of Sarah. Very slowly, he lowered his great head until his muzzle was just inches from her face. Sarah could feel his warm breath on her cheek as he investigated her scent, her energy, the subtle signals that would tell him whether she was truly the partner she claimed to be. "I see you," Sarah whispered, raising her hand slowly to touch his cheek. "I see who you really are. And it's magnificent." Havoc stood perfectly still for her touch, his eyes soft with something that looked remarkably like gratitude. In that moment, something fundamental shifted between them. Not dominance and submission, but mutual recognition and respect. From that day forward, Havoc's paddock gate remained open during the daytime hours. He was free to roam the entire sanctuary property, to run the hills and valleys as he chose. But he always returned to his paddock at evening feeding time. More importantly, he began to seek out Sarah's company, approaching her when she worked in the barn, following her as she did chores around the property, and standing quietly nearby when she sat on her hill to read. The horse world began to take notice. Word spread through the community about the untrainable stallion who had found peace at Wild Heart Sanctuary. Trainers who had failed with Havoc came to see what Sarah was doing differently. Horse owners, with their own difficult animals, began making pilgrimages to the sanctuary, hoping to find answers. What they found challenged everything they thought they knew about horse training. Sarah wasn't training Havoc at all, at least not in any conventional sense. Instead, she was building a relationship based on mutual respect and understanding. The stallion learned to accept a halter, not because he was forced to, but because he chose to trust Sarah enough to wear one. He allowed her to groom him, not because he had been conditioned to submit, but because he enjoyed the attention and care. Most remarkably, Havoc began to work with Sarah on various tasks around the sanctuary. He would carry supplies and saddlebags, help move other horses from paddock to paddock, and even allow visitors to sit on his back, not because he had been broken to saddle, but because he had chosen to share his strength and abilities with a human he trusted. The transformation wasn't just in Havoc. Sarah found herself changed by the experience as well. Working with the stallion had taught her things about leadership, communication, and trust that she had never learned in traditional horse training. She began to apply these insights to the other horses at the sanctuary, and the results were remarkable. Horses that have been labeled as dangerous or untrainable began to blossom under her approach. The Wild Heart method, as it came to be known, attracted attention from around the country. Equine behaviorists, veterinarians, and trainers came to study what Sarah was doing. Universities sent graduate students to document her techniques. Horse rescue organizations began adopting her philosophy of partnership over dominance. But perhaps the most meaningful validation came from an unexpected source. Tom Brooks, the BLM facility manager, who had been so skeptical of Sarah's approach, visited the sanctuary 6 months after Havoc's adoption. He had come to see for himself whether the notorious stallion was truly thriving or simply being warehoused in more comfortable circumstances. What he found exceeded his expectations entirely. Havoc greeted him at the gate, alert and curious, but showing none of the tension and resistance that had characterized his behavior at the BLM facility. The stallion allowed Tom to pet him, even lifting his head to have his neck scratched. A gesture of trust that brought tears to the experienced horse manager's eyes. "I've been working with wild horses for 20 years, Tom told Sarah as they watched Havoc graze peacefully in the late afternoon sun. "And I've never seen anything like this. He's still completely himself. You can see it in every line of his body. But he's also found a way to be part of the human world without losing his essential nature." Sarah nodded, understanding exactly what Tom meant. That was always the goal, not to break him, but to bridge the gap between his world and ours. Havoc's story began to attract national attention when a documentary crew arrived to film him for a program about alternative approaches to horse training. The resulting film, Unbroken, The Havoc Story, won several awards and introduced Sarah's methods to a worldwide audience. Havoc seemed to understand his role as an ambassador for a new way of thinking. When visitors came to the sanctuary, he would often approach them on his own, allowing them to see up close that a horse could maintain his wild dignity while still choosing to interact positively with humans. Children were especially drawn to him, perhaps sensing that he represented a different possibility for the relationship between species. One of the most touching visits came from a young girl named Emma, whose own horse had been labeled as dangerous after a series of incidents at her local riding stable. Emma's parents had heard about Havoc and driven 8 hours to meet him, hoping to find some answers about their daughter's struggling relationship with her horse. Havoc approached Emma immediately, drawn perhaps by the sadness he sensed in the child. As the girl stood by the fence, tears streaming down her face as she talked about feeling like a failure as a horse person, Havoc gently rested his head on her shoulder. "He doesn't think you're a failure," Sarah told Emma softly. "And neither do I. Sometimes the horses that challenge us the most are the ones trying to teach us the most important lessons." Emma spent the afternoon with Havoc, walking beside him as he grazed, brushing his coat, and simply sitting in his presence. By the end of the visit, her entire posture had changed. She stood straighter, smiled more readily, and spoke with newfound confidence about going home to try a different approach with her horse. 3 months later, Sarah received a letter from Emma's mother. The girl had returned home and began applying what she'd learned from Havoc to her work with her own horse. Instead of trying to force compliance, she began building a relationship based on trust and mutual respect. The dangerous horse was now Emma's closest companion, and the pair had become leaders in their local 4-H club, teaching other young people about partnership-based horsemanship. Similar stories began arriving regularly at Wild Heart Sanctuary. Trainers who had embraced Sarah's methods reported breakthrough after breakthrough, with horses that had previously been considered hopeless cases. The sanctuary's waiting list grew as more and more difficult horses were referred to Sarah's program. But Havoc remained the heart of it all. Now 8 years old, he had grown even more magnificent with time and good care. His coat gleamed with health, his eyes sparkled with intelligence and contentment, and his presence had an almost magnetic quality that drew both horses and humans to him. The stallion had become a teacher as well as a symbol. Sarah began offering workshops at the sanctuary, using Havoc to demonstrate the principles of partnership-based training. Participants would watch in amazement as the horse responded to the subtlest signals, not from fear or conditioning, but from genuine cooperation and understanding. The secret Sarah would tell workshop participants as they watched Havoc work isn't to break the horse's spirit. It's to honor that spirit while creating a framework for cooperation. Havoc taught me that a horse doesn't have to be diminished in order to be useful. In fact, the most useful horses are the ones who maintain their essential wildness while choosing to share their gifts with humans. Havoc's influence extended far beyond the horse world. His story became a metaphor for anyone who had ever been told they were too difficult, too wild, too much trouble to be worth the effort. Schools began using his story to teach children about the importance of accepting differences rather than forcing conformity. Therapists referenced his journey when working with clients who felt like they didn't fit into society's expectations. The stallion's daily life reflected the philosophy that had saved him. Each morning, he would greet Sarah at the fence, not because he was required to, but because he chose to. He would work alongside her on various sanctuary tasks, contributing his strength and intelligence to the common good. In the afternoons, he would often seek out visiting horses who seemed stressed or afraid, offering them the calm leadership that helped them adapt to their new environment. But Havoc never lost the essential wildness that defined him. In the evenings, he could still be seen running across the sanctuary's hills with the same joy and freedom he had displayed on that first day. His spirit remained unbroken, undiminished, and uncompromised. Dr. Reeves, observing Havoc during one of her regular visits, marveled at the completeness of what Sarah had achieved. "You know," she told Sarah as they watched the stallion graze peacefully nearby, "most people would say you succeeded in training him, but I think what you really did was train yourself to understand him." Sarah smiled, reaching out to stroke Havoc's neck as he approached them. Maybe that's what training has always been supposed to be. Not breaking one spirit to serve another, but finding the common ground where two spirits can meet as equals. 5 years after his arrival at Wild Heart Sanctuary, Havoc faced his greatest test. A severe drought had struck the region, forcing Sarah to make the difficult decision to temporarily relocate some of her horses to facilities with better water sources. Several other sanctuaries offered to take Havoc, but Sarah worried about how the stallion would handle another transition, another new environment where he might not be understood. The night before the scheduled move, Sarah spent hours with Havoc in his paddock, explaining the situation as if he could understand every word. "I know this feels like betrayal," she told him, her voice thick with emotion. "I know you've been through this before, and it never ended well. But this time is different. This time, you're going to people who understand what you are and what you need." Havoc stood quietly throughout her explanation, his head lowered to rest against her shoulder. When she finished speaking, he lifted his head and looked directly into her eyes, and Sarah could have sworn she saw understanding there, along with something that looked remarkably like forgiveness. The temporary placement was with Mountain View Sanctuary in Colorado, a facility that had adopted Sarah's partnership-based methods. After sending several staff members to her workshops, the director, Maria Santos, had worked with Havoc during one of Sarah's training sessions and understood his unique needs. The goodbye was heartbreaking. As Havoc loaded calmly into the trailer, a far cry from the forced loading that had characterized his earlier moves, Sarah found herself fighting back tears. "I'll come get you as soon as the drought breaks," she promised. "This isn't forever." Havoc turned to look at her one last time before the trailer doors closed, and Sarah saw in his eyes the absolute trust that had grown between them over 5 years. He understood that this separation was necessary, and he trusted her promise to return for him. The reports from Mountain View were beyond encouraging. Havoc had adapted to his new environment with remarkable grace, accepting the change as a temporary necessity rather than a betrayal. He had even begun working with some of the more traumatized horses at the Colorado facility, offering them the same calm leadership that had helped so many horses at Wild Art. But perhaps more importantly, Havoc's presence at Mountain View sparked the same transformation that had occurred at Wild Art. Horses that had been struggling began to improve. Staff members found themselves adopting more partnership-based approaches. Visitors left inspired by the stallion's story and eager to apply his lessons to their own relationships with horses. When Sarah finally returned to collect Havoc 6 months later, she found a horse who had not only maintained his essential nature, but had grown even more confident and secure in his identity. The reunion was joyful, with Havoc greeting Sarah with obvious delight while showing none of the anxiety that might have been expected after such a separation. "He never doubted you would come back," Maria told Sarah as they loaded Havoc for the return journey. That kind of trust is incredible to witness. But more than that, he's taught our entire staff something about what real security looks like. It's not about controlling your environment. It's about knowing who you are so completely that you can adapt to any environment without losing yourself. The return to Wild Art Sanctuary marked the beginning of a new chapter in Havoc's story. Now 11 years old, he had become something approaching a legend in the horse world. His influence had spread far beyond Nevada, inspiring a global movement toward more humane and effective training methods. But for Sarah, the most meaningful aspect of Havoc's legacy wasn't the awards, the recognition, or the widespread adoption of her methods. It was the daily miracle of their partnership, the way he still chose every single day to trust her with his remarkable spirit. Standing in the same paddock where Havoc had first experienced freedom after 2 years of captivity, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them both to this point. The stallion, who had been labeled untrainable, had become one of the most influential horses of his generation. The trainer, who had been considered unconventional, had sparked a revolution in how humans understood their relationships with horses. Havoc approached her as the sun set over the sanctuary, his steps as fluid and graceful as they had been on that first day. At 11, he remained magnificent, his coat still gleaming with health, his eyes still bright with intelligence and spirit. He had never been broken because he had never needed to be. Instead, he had found a way to remain completely himself while building a bridge to the human world. "Thank you," Sarah whispered as she stroked his neck, a ritual that had become as natural as breathing over their 7 years together. "Thank you for teaching me that strength and cooperation aren't opposites. Thank you for showing me that trust is the only training method that really matters." Havoc lowered his head to rest against her shoulder, his breath warm against her neck. In that simple gesture was everything that defined their relationship. Mutual respect, absolute trust, and the recognition that both of their spirits had remained unbroken while finding a way to soar together. This incredible story of Havoc and Sarah proves that the wildest spirits often have the most to teach us about freedom, trust, and what it truly means to remain unbroken. If this powerful story of partnership over control and understanding over force truly touched your heart, take a moment to hit the like button and share this message with someone who needs a reminder that respect is stronger than dominance. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Stories for Horseback, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another inspiring story about courage, connection, and the extraordinary bond between humans and horses. We would also love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments which part of Havoc's journey impacted you the most. And let us know which country you're watching from so we can see how far this story has traveled around the world. Your support means everything to us and helps us continue bringing meaningful, life-changing stories to light. Always remember, in a world that often tries to tame every wild spirit into conformity, there are still brave hearts who understand that some souls are meant to stay wild and free, and that the greatest victories are not won through control, but through patience, trust, and true understanding.